Welcome to the Bare Marriage Podcast. I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire from ToLoveHonorAndVacuum.com, and every Thursday we like to join you where we can unpack some of the terrible marriage teachings and discover what God really intended, because our God is a God of love and He's a God of life, and that's what our marriages should look like too. So joining me today, I have my daughter Rebecca Lindenbach.
Hi.
Who is often here, but we have another special guest, Joanna Sawatsky.
Hello.
She is our co-author for The Great Sex Rescue. She is our statistician extraordinaire, and she is here all the way from the Arctic.
Yes.
She is visiting for a couple of weeks. We do need to say that Becca and I are part of a bubble. Joanna and her husband have both been fully vaccinated.
And we also quarantined for 2 weeks before we came down. So no
yay.
worries.
We're writing a whole book together in a month, and it was required that we do it together, so
here we are. Yeah. But that being done, speaking of books, girls, it is now 2 months since The Great Sex Rescue was published.
Yes,
Amazing.
It's over 2 months.
And the sales have been wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard so many stories of people that are buying multiple copies for friends, and especially counselors who are buying, which is really
wonderful.
Encouraging.
Yes.
But what we haven't heard is from some of the authors that we critiqued in the book and some of the evangelical leaders. So we want to do a thought exercise as we start this show today of what would have happened if.
What would have happened if they listened?
So for those of you who don't know, our book, The Great Sex Rescue, it was out March 2nd. It's based on our survey of 20,000 women, largest survey ever done of women's marital and sexual satisfaction in the evangelical church. And we were looking at which evangelical teachings most messed up sex and marriage. And to do that, we also looked at where those evangelical teachings are in 13 of our bestsellers.
Yes.
And in those bestsellers, many of the authors themselves talked about how
Their
women...
teachings harm people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to read some of those and show how if they had listened to their own readers, to their own fans,
Yes.
from the beginning, we never would have had to do any of this.
Yeah.
I could be a very mild-mannered epidemiologist.
Exactly.
Yeah, this never would have had to happen. So again, we're not the ones being mean or unfair. This is the consequence of ignoring voices for 20 years.
Okay,
So let's read from Love and Respect. So here's an example that Emerson Eggerichs writes in his book, Love and Respect. Sometimes the love and respect connection can seem to backfire, as it did for this wife, whose husband monitored her respect meter, so to speak, to see how well she was doing. Now, whenever her husband senses anything that smacks of disrespect, even when it isn't, it reminds him of our past, and he gets infuriated. I haven't seen such rage in a while. Actually, I regret letting him know about what I had learned from you, because he uses it against me each time. I can take on the criticism. I feel I deserve it. But his rage is withering and makes me want to get away and hide. So he tells a story of a woman who, let's say this, is being abused because of his message.
Yeah, if you feel like your husband has withering rage so that you need to get away and hide, that is an abusive marriage.
Like, that is not safe.
No.
Yep.
That is not safe. And what does Eggerichs say? Eggerichs doesn't say, wow, I'm so sorry that my message backfired. He talks about his own parents. He says, my father would become enraged at my mother. To offset his strong feelings of personal guilt, he would take offense at things my mother innocently did and then explode. But she never saw herself as a victim. Not once in all my years growing up did I hear mom badmouth dad. So that's the advice he gives to an abused woman because of his teaching. He doesn't take any introspection. He doesn't question. He doesn't say, wait a minute, maybe I'm causing abuse to flourish. Instead, he says, well, my mother, who, by the way, let's remember, his father attempted to strangle his mother.
Yes, we have that in another podcast. He talks about this frequently.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's remember, this is a astoundingly violent and abusive marriage that he is talking about when he talks about his parents.
Yeah.
He says, my mom didn't see herself as a victim and never said a bad word about dad, and that's what you should do.
Yeah, you know what? If your husband attempts to strangle you, you are a victim, and you need to get help, because once your husband has tried to strangle you, he is now 7 times more likely to kill you.
Yep. And so this is serious. So Emerson Eggerichs, if you had listened to the women who messaged you, who talked to you at conferences, who sent you letters saying the abuse got worse, saying I'm scared of my husband, saying I feel used, saying I can't handle this anymore, we never would have had to read your book. We never would have had to do a survey of 20,000 women, and you would not be dealing with the backlash you are today. This book should have never been written because you were told that before it came out.
Okay, let's turn to Every Man's Battle. In the original Every Man's Battle that was written in, I think, 2000, he had a number of women read this, often the wives of the authors, and they had astonishingly terrible reactions to what was being written in Every Man's Battle. In fact, here is the reaction of Brenda, who is Fred's wife. Fred is one of the authors of Every Man's Battle. And she said, "Men seem like untrustworthy pigs whose minds and thoughts just go wherever they want. It's nothing sacred to them. As women, do we trust men after reading this? You can't even trust a pastor to be a pure person. I feel that if anything ever happened to Fred, I'd never remarry because I would have very little trust in men." And what is their response to Brenda? It's saying, we know women respond this way, but it's just very important that they understand this is just how men are. And that's what they say throughout the book. We got there naturally simply by being male. Now, interestingly, Brenda and Fred co-authored Every Heart Restored, which was actually even worse than Every Man's Battle. And when you look at the chapters that Brenda and Fred write, they often contradict each other. It's like Brenda's trying to be healthy and Fred keeps doubling down on men just lust and women need to understand it. And that's the message that keeps coming across. Women just need to understand men. There is no attempt of men to understand how much this message hurts women.
Or to just frankly take responsibility for their actions.
Yeah.
Like, they could grow up. That would be an alternative.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, and now to Through a Man's Eyes by Shanti Feldham and Craig Gross. Several have told us, I'm never going to be able to trust my husband again now that I know how visual he is. And more than a few devastated husbands have told us that their wives stopped being intimate with them altogether once they learned the truth about how men are wired.
Yeah.
That's really a problem.
So she's saying this is the feedback she got after For Women Only.
What we're trying to get at here is all of these authors had multiple chances to question and say, maybe I'm wrong. They had multiple victims standing in front of them saying, you hurt me, and they chose to ignore them. So that's what happened before we entered the picture.
And I just want to point out the last phrase in that paragraph that
The truth about.
once they learned the truth about how men are wired. So again, it's that attitude. Women just need to understand how men are. There's never an attempt to say, wow, if what we're saying is impacting women that much, maybe we are misunderstanding
How God created
how
men
God
and women.
created
And
men.
frankly, it's also an astounding lack of humility.
That's what I was going to say.
Because we all, the three of us, have all changed our minds about various things. I mean, for example, sexless marriages, we all had some real learning to do that came out of the research that we did for the Great Sex Rescue.
Yeah.
And that should be normal. Yeah. That we are fallible human beings. I am not God. Neither are you. Neither, like, Shanti Feldham does not have a special beam down from the Almighty that she knows perfect truth from God.
Yeah.
Like, we are all fallible and all sin in various ways. Like, we can all get something wrong. Yeah, I just am astonished at the lack of teachability and the hard-heartedness, frankly, from these authors.
Yeah.
And that was all before we even did anything.
Yeah, so these authors knew all of this before they wrote their books because they wrote it in their books, the books themselves.
Yep.
So then 2019 comes along. We read Love and Respect for the first time.
Yep. That was a doozy.
I write about it on the blog. We get hundreds of stories of abuse.
No, first of all, the reason we read Love and Respect in the first place is because you had been getting stories and comments about Love and Respect for months, and we listened.
Yes.
The reason we read Love and Respect was not because we were like, hey, we're marriage authors, let's go after the number one marriage author in our space. Nope. It's because we got so many comments from women saying Love and Respect ruined my sex life. Love and Respect ruined my marriage. I was abused because of Love and Respect. And so we said, well, we should really check this out.
Yeah. So one day I saw it on Twitter, it reminded me, and I thought I will look. And then I wrote about it for a week. We had hundreds of stories of women saying this book made abuse worse in my marriage. And so Joanna created a report.
And in that report, I will say that exact paragraph that Rebecca read was in the report to Focus on the Family, saying, hey, this was known ahead of time. Just FYI.
And we sent it to Focus on the Family, and they ignored it.
Yep. Focus on the Family didn't listen.
No, and it was because they didn't listen that we decided we needed to go big or go home. We thought if they can ignore hundreds of women, maybe they can't ignore 20,000.
Yep. Exactly.
And so that is why we wrote The Great Sex Rescue.
Yep.
Because they ignored us.
And then, after we wrote The Great Sex Rescue, we continued to talk about these issues. We called out the authors again and again. We shared stories of the abuse. We even sent our findings about the teachings in For Women Only to Shanti Felton herself in August. Remember, our book was not published until March 2nd.
Yeah, it wasn't finalized in August, and we were inviting her to comment.
Our final edits were handed in mid-November. So we sent her stuff ahead of time, and we even offered if she wanted to kind of make a statement recanting any of the harmful teachings, which I know is a horrible and humiliating email. I know that's not fun to get.
Yeah.
I know that's incredibly humbling.
Yeah, but James 3:1 is a verse that exists, that not many of us should presume to be teachers, because we who teach will be judged more strictly.
Yep.
If you sign up to teach, you sign up to have to eat crow.
Yep.
Yep.
You sign up to eat humble pie if you need to. You have to do the hard thing because, frankly, that's the role that you signed up for. You are the shepherd. You are in charge of taking care of the sheep. And if you fail in that, you're responsible.
Yep. And she didn't listen in August.
No. What we did was we sent her the findings on 2 of our main teachings because we found them in her books. The teachings that we measured, All Men Struggle with Lust, It's Every Man's Battle, which we found in For Women Only.
Yep.
And Boys
should.
Will Push Girls' Sexual Boundaries,
Yep.
which we found in For Young Women Only. And her response was she was very gracious, actually, in the email. She took it really well and was very kind. But she just said that she didn't believe that she taught those things.
Yeah, she just denied that she taught any of those teachings, even though we had, quotes.
She says she doesn't teach that all men struggle with lust. Instead, what she teaches is that most men struggle with visual stimulation and temptation in this sexualized culture, but they work to fight it.
Which is just the same way as saying all men struggle with lust.
I know.
Also, throughout her book, she says most men, but then she also says all men. And if you don't, don't even bother talking to your husband about it because he will lie to you.
Yeah.
So, this is the thing, is whether or not you intend to say something, if people are coming to you saying you did this, it is incumbent on you to listen. But Focus on the Family didn't listen. Emerson Eggerichs didn't listen. The authors of Every Man's Battle didn't listen when their wives said it hurt them. And that's their wives.
Yes.
If you don't care if you hurt your wives, anyway, these authors have continuously ignored it over and over again, and they have left thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of abuse victims in their wake.
Because the most harmful books that we looked at, I mean, they sold in excess of like 25 million copies.
In total, yeah.
In total, something like that. I know you've been doing that work. Okay, and then here's another good example, Mark Gungor.
Yeah. This one just infuriates me because it was so simple, and he chose to go up a mountain when he could just cross a small bridge.
It was just funny because he wrote, as some of you know, I talked about this earlier, but he wrote a post about how sexless marriages are grounds for separation and even divorce. And I made a comment saying that it's more nuanced than that because sexlessness tends to be a symptom of a bigger problem.
Yeah.
It isn't the problem itself. And what we found in our survey of 20,000 women is that sexless marriages don't tend to just happen. There's usually something else going on. And he just went ballistic.
And we did write it in a way where he could have just very easily said, actually, you know what? So anyone who doesn't know what happened with the Mark Gungor, we're going to post a link to an article by Shannon Ashley that really does a great job of kind of outlining everything that happened. You can find that in the show notes. But I want to actually jump to someone who did this right as a contrast to show what Mark and all of these authors could have done.
Yeah.
So a couple weeks ago, Henry Cloud posted...
Yeah, he's the author of Boundaries.
He's the author of Boundaries. Posted a kind of just a meme on his Facebook page that some people took to be discouraging women in abusive relationships to get out.
Yeah, he was sort of saying, it was sort of like it takes two to tango. Like if there's a problem in your marriage, you both kind of contributed in some way.
Yeah, like if there's a problem, don't point fingers, look at yourself first. So something along those lines, right? And a bunch of people commented saying, dude, abuse. I'm pretty sure when my husband hit me, I didn't do anything to deserve that. Are you saying I should have stayed? And he immediately went down the comment section and said, oh my goodness, this is not what I mean at all. Let me clarify. This is really important. If you are in an abusive marriage, not everything is two ways. We're talking about normal disagreements and petty fights in a healthy marriage. Otherwise, if you're being abused, please get out. I will always be a huge advocate of women's safety. And he just handled it so incredibly well. Yeah. And everyone was sharing this post saying, wow, this is why we love Henry Cloud. This is why we love the book Boundaries. What a humble guy. He really puts the safety and prioritizes women's well-being. This is awesome. He posted something that people disagreed with, And it worked to his benefit because he apologized so quickly and he changed just the nuance behind it so quickly, and he listened.
Yeah.
He humbled himself, realized he misspoke because he didn't think it through all the way.
Yeah.
And he just adjusted his message.
And that's probably why Boundaries in Marriage was one of our top scoring books.
And it's consistently one of the books that we hear that abused women, it helps them see that they were being mistreated.
Yeah.
You know?
And from a totally banal perspective, it also sells really well. Like,
Yeah.
I think it would be easy for an author to say, well, I can't recant or apologize because then I'll lose my platform.
But, like, no, in this day and age, apologizing and being transparent actually helps because people want to know they can trust you. So then we look at Mark Gungor as a contrast. If Mark had done what Henry did and added a comment or just edited his, because Henry's was a picture, so he couldn't edit it, whereas Gungor's was all text. He could have just edited it on Facebook and just said, by the way, I'm not talking about sexlessness where you stopped having sex because you're being mistreated. If Mark did what Henry did, it literally would have looked like adding a sentence or two to his original thing, or even just adding a comment saying, and by the way, sexlessness can sometimes be a symptom of a larger issue, and that is a different situation.
Yeah.
We are just talking about sexlessness due to, like, porn addiction, or due to, like, having an affair elsewhere. Like, obvious reasons why the sexlessness is a real issue. He could have just done that, and then we would have been, good job, Mark, the exact same way we did to Henry Cloud.
Yeah.
We would have been able to praise Mark to the skies and been like, wow, this is a guy who really cares about the well-being of his listeners.
And instead, he started deleting all my followers' comments and called me crazy. He's sorry I'm real.
Yeah. It was
He
bizarre.
doesn't
Again, you can see
respect
all
me.
this.
It's really weird.
I will say, I have not had this experience since I, stopped talking to, since, I wasn't in high school anymore.
Yeah.
I have not had such a juvenile online experience with a grown man.
It was really weird.
No, I think 13-year-olds are kind of, that's the best way to describe his mental state during that. So you can check out the article if you want to hear more about that.
It's actually really funny.
Yeah, it's genuinely not even that infuriating because it's just kind of
Farcical.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the point is, there's always a way to listen and respond with compassion and grace and humility. And some authors have shown that. Henry Cloud has shown that. And that is why he continues to have the respect and the trust of people who are abuse advocates. Emerson Eggerichs has shown the opposite of that. Shanti Feldon has shown the opposite of that. The authors of Every Man's Battle have shown the opposite of that. Mark Gungor has shown the opposite of that. And we need to no longer have it be okay that you can teach and you can have influence over people's lives and not care how your influence affects them.
Yeah. We have just done the largest survey that has ever been done in the evangelical world about Christian women's sexual and marriage satisfaction. And no one's talking about it in the
powers that be.
evangelical powers that be.
Nope.
Everybody's talking about it down here.
Yeah.
And our book is selling really well and counselors are buying it.
And I'm going to say,
everything.
frankly, we enjoy more this group of people anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, we love you all.
But, we have not seen even other authors in the marriage space that we didn't talk about have not come on board.
Nope.
I don't know anybody who has, really, who's like a bigger
Who's
name.
not doing deconstruction work already. Like, we got
Yeah.
lots of people who are on board who are, like, awesome, huge authors in their own right.
Geez, like Laura Barringer and Scott McKnight have been great. Kristen
Rachel
DeMay,
Joy Welch, Kristen
Beth
DeMay,
Allison
Beth-
Barr,
our whole,
so many.
Our whole, the whole group of women who are shaking the church, we're all in this together.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the cultural kind of powers that be within evangelicalism, they're suspiciously silent.
Yeah.
And I think it's because everyone is realizing that in order to address our findings, in order to actually look at our survey, they're going to have to apologize. And I don't think they're willing to do that.
Yeah.
I hope that they prove us wrong, but it has been 2 months, and these authors knew this was coming for like a year.
And they haven't done
And they
anything.
haven't done a single thing.
Yeah. So I'm going to finish out this segment with a little story from Prince Caspian from the Chronicles of Narnia, which I don't know about any of you, but I grew up entirely obsessed with.
Yes.
So the 4 Pevensey kids are traveling toward Prince Caspian, who they're going to try to rescue. They're on a rescue mission, and Lucy, the youngest, sees Aslan. And she says to her siblings, "Hey, yo, we got to follow." And gets patted on the head by her 2 eldest siblings. And they say, "Nope, we're keeping going the way we're going. We're gonna let's do it." And that night, Aslan comes to her, and she has this wonderful embrace with him. It's lovely. And then she says, "Oh, but I should have followed you earlier. What would have happened?" And he says, my child, no one is ever told what would have happened. But anyone can find out what will happen now. If you go back, wake the others, and then they start on their quest. Nobody knows truly what would have happened if Emerson Eggerichs had listened to that woman who came to him with the story of how she was being abused. Nobody can know. But anybody can find out what will happen if he stands up and says, guess what, I messed up. For the sake of the kingdom of God. And I know how big of a deal it is to invoke the kingdom of God in this. But let us remember that Jesus talks about how precious to God is a single sparrow, and how much more precious to him are the women who have been abused. And if not for the sake of those suffering, because of the teachings that the evangelical world has taught, then for what will these authors apologize?
Yep, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so with that preamble, we have 2 more segments coming with some interviews that I did, but we want to share our false teaching of the week, which kind of threads through everything. Becca, would you like to say it?
So our false teaching is this. God's design is that women's voices are silenced so that men's can be louder. And both of the interviews that are coming up are going to talk about that from 2 different angles, so I hope you enjoy.
Okay, we are here on Zoom, and I have brought Timothy Thomas on with me. Timothy, he is a teacher and a coach and a writer, and he wrote this amazing article that I read. Gosh, it must have been like a year ago. And then I found him on Twitter because he was talking about it, and I'm like, oh, I need to have him on. So he wrote an article, Divorcing White Evangelicalism and Remarrying My Wife. So Timothy, hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. I'm so glad that we could connect. This is awesome. Now, you're from Fort Worth, just so everyone knows. So you're like in Texas, where I assume it's warmer now, and I'm up here in Canada where it's freezing, but it's so cool that we can connect anyway. And I read this article where you just were talking about how you realized that your church was not a great one for you, but your wife came to that realization first. And so I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit of your story, and then I got some questions I want to ask you after.
Awesome. So just a quick kind of rundown of me and my wife's story. We met in college out in Abilene, Texas, where at the time I was there, I don't know if it's still the case, but they had the most churches per capita in the world, I believe.
I can believe that.
Might have just been the United States. But so yeah, just everywhere you turn, there's, some sort of church of some sort of denomination. Met the Lord there and met my wife there, and so then just kind of started growing and learning about Reformed theology, and also all the sort of cultural aspects that came along with that. So learning very early on to just sort of ditch my cultural identity of what I've grown up with, especially as an African American man in the church I grew up in, which was predominantly African American, and all the other things that come along with that in church, particularly in white evangelical churches, is kind of almost in a sense of I would classify today as just a dominating viewpoint, or just a conquering viewpoint of just about everything. So everything from arguments to our notions of who should be the leader, who should make all the decisions in the home and things like that. And so my wife and I we got engaged under that, we're married under that. And very early on, my wife, she's very much an independent thinker, thinks outside the box, but for the longest, I just always took it as her just not being submissive and being outside the notion of, like, especially when we looked at a lot of the other young ladies and all the other women that were kind of in our circles, she was just very different from all the other women, and there's just certain things that she just wasn't going to ride with. And so I took offense to that, and then just she wanted to kind of better our life in wanting to become a nurse and things like that. So she had to travel. Then we moved here to Fort Worth after we got married. She had to travel back and forth to Abilene to get her nursing degree for a whole year. And during that time as well, it was just very tumultuous from then on for about the next 4 or 5 years. And just really just missing each other and just this disconnect. And a lot of it had to do with my idea of her not listening to me, her not submitting to what I wanted, and obviously everything from the decisions that she was making to when we wanted to have sex and when that should be. And she just she wasn't gonna have it. And so as I started to learn or start to think outside more of the scope of the, I'll just identify them as white evangelical authors and sort of like these reform theological circles. And then also on top of that, a lot of the social and racial unrest, and started to see a lot of things just start breaking down then, and seeing how these people were reacting or weren't reacting to certain things that were going on in the culture, especially when in regards to people that look like me and my wife. Then that's when I really started questioning a lot of things, and a lot of things that my wife was already like, I try to tell you. Um, so then, then I started rethinking like, okay, well, this idea, because a lot of it had to do with just white male head leadership and conquering, and they wouldn't say it as in explicit terms what I say goes, but in the end, like, I should have the final word and the final say of what happens in regards to everything in our life. Just seeing how like there wasn't any cohesion for us in terms of how we learn from one another, how we actually are helping one another, how I'm sacrificing for her. And long story short, now today, I mean, obviously we're not perfect by any means, but we just vibe so much better today as a result of me not feeling this weight or this pressure of feeling like she has to listen to my final word and do as I say, and really just lay down and submit to me in ways that please me. That's kind of where we're at today. And I don't know, we just vibe so much better now, especially after we stepped away from the church that we were in, which was, very much, white evangelical in terms of the way that everything is structured as well. And just the things that she saw in the church that was happening that I didn't want to see. She saw it long before me as well too. And it was kind of weird. Like once we went to counseling, and which our church helped us pay for, then that's when I started to realize a lot of these things that, like, it's not about me, nor this idea of headship that I think is very misconstrued a lot of times.
So she knew this before you did. So she seriously frustrated with you then? Like how did she have those conversations with you when she was like, no, this isn't the way this is going to work?
I mean, it wouldn't come out in the best of ways from her. I think she would agree with that as well too. But because my language was always draped in Christianese, and I always had an argument that was not even necessarily based in scripture, or if it was, it wasn't said in a proper way. It was mainly just so I can have my point and defeat her argument. But for her, it was just like, all right, I mean, that's cool, but that's not right. It was just, I don't know, it's just very different. And her being like that, and then me coming like out on the other side, I guess you can say, kind of also gave me the freedom to be able to go back and realize that it's okay for me to express myself and who I am culturally and ethnically, and it doesn't have to be in this shell of what is most presentable to a lot of my white evangelical brothers that I was within the church.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you went to counseling and that helped you see that the way that you were operating wasn't really good. Now, I know a lot of people go to counseling and it's not that helpful. And then some people go to counseling and it's amazing. Yours obviously was good. Was there something in particular that you felt was positive about it? Or could you give people any tips on how to know when a counseling experience is good?
Yeah, so our counselor, I feel like he just gave us the freedom to just be us, and to kind of step back and give us the space to to communicate how we feel, and just ask questions. And I didn't ever really get the sense that he was trying to steer us to a particular point. And even like to today, like he would tell us, because like after things started getting really much better, we would miss like a month, we didn't hear from him, then we scheduled another meeting, and then like, oh yeah, I was going to contact y'all, and you're like, no you weren't. But because I don't think his goal was to just get us to keep coming back. I think his goal was to just get us to speak to each other in a healthy manner, in a way that would build would build us up without him having to be present
That's
for us.
great. That's great. Now, I know you mentioned too in your article, part of it was you guys did end up fighting over sex quite a bit, and you had this entitlement view that she was resisting, obviously. Can you speak into that at all? How the
Yeah,
church.
yeah.
Mhm.
So I think that you just take what is kind of taught about, again, what is the role of a husband and a wife, and usually the passages pull from Ephesians. Supposed to be the head of the wife and love her like Christ loved the church, and things like that. And so there was this burden of, I feel like I'm trying to do what is best for us, and you have another idea of what you think is best for us, and now you're doing what you feel is best for us, and it's not what I think is best for us. So you take our example of our second year of marriage of her thinking what was best for us is going to nursing school and getting a nursing degree so she can make money so we can try to start building wealth and eventually build a home and all this stuff. And I didn't see that picture. I just saw, why don't you just be a stay-at-home wife and serve me?
Mhm.
And so her not seeing my point of view and not submitting to what I wanted, then there became this burden, like I'm living outside of the will of God and who God has called me to be as a husband. And so
Mhm.
then it leads to me, or for me anyways, it led to just trying to find other ways of trying to find some sort of control. So
Mhm.
then from there you start looking to your work, and then when you're not as successful there and you can't control everything there, for me then it turned into, well, what can I control in other areas? And that's about the time that a lot of the social unrest and racial injustice started coming to the forefront. It's like, well, what can I control there? And so then I can't control that, and so now what else can I control? And then I'm trying to find other people that can validate me, because again, I feel like I'm not being who God has called me to be as a husband. And
Mhm.
so just more burdens and more burdens and more burdens. I can't control any of these things. And it stemmed from this idea that I'm not controlling my household. So again, you kind of already have the sense of how my wife is and who she is. But so obviously she's like, we're not in a good space. I'm not just going to have sex with you just because you want to have sex with me. And so then there on top of that, it's like, well, now not only am I not controlling my house, but now my wife doesn't even want me, and she won't listen to me. She won't lay down and have sex with me when I want it. And so now I start looking at her as the problem and looking at everybody else as the problem. And all of that kind of did lead to, did stem from this entitlement to, I'm head of the house. This is what I say goes, and you won't have sex with me. You won't play the
Mhm.
role that I want you to play. It just all just kind of came crumbling down, and for definitely in a good way.
And so when it came crumbling down, you guys said that you're going to a different church now too? Like
Yeah,
a
I mean, we're honestly we're still looking. I think we're pretty close to a place, but
yeah.
yeah, we left.
I'm in the same place. We think we know where we're going to start going now too. So I hear you. I hear you. And I know that a lot of people too will say, okay, but what do you do now with the verses that do say that the husband is the head of the wife? Like, do you just throw out the Bible now, or have you come to a new way of seeing that?
I still grapple with it, honestly. Trying to figure out what those things mean, but I think also understanding context matters, and also for scriptures like that, what I reference in Ephesians, emphasizing the loving her like Christ loved the church more than being the head and being so called the final say. And this was explained to me a long time ago by somebody else from my former church, the church I grew up in. It's like that's not your focus. Like your focus
Mhm.
is continually sacrificing and doing what you need to do to let her know that you love her no matter what. And if she feels like what she's doing is best for our family and you disagree, then you let her do that, because in the same way that I feel like sometimes I know what I'm doing is best for me,
Mhm.
God doesn't always allow me not to do something. Sometimes He lets me do it, and then I look back and say, "Dang, I shouldn't have did that." And so. And if that's the case, then then that's the case. Then my wife is also very humble enough to admit when she's wrong as well too. Being able to have that type of understanding about our relationship with God and who God is and the ways that He loves us and the ways that He's forgiving, and trying to model that rather than just these words that I want to fit my category of who I want to be as the conqueror, as the master, as the head, as the boss is a better way of looking at the scriptures rather than just what the way that I want to see it.
So is she a nurse now? Is she all qualified? And
She's a nurse. She just got a promotion. She's a manager now of a whole clinic. She's balling, and I'm really excited for her. And, I'm really proud of her. She's. I mean, I think so highly of her. So many different ways. She just got it together, and I just wish I would listen to her a long time ago.
that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. Do you still write?
Yes, I still write. I'm a staff writer for Christ and Pop Culture over at christandpopculture.com, and I've written for some different local places like the Fort Worth Star Telegram, Rapzilla. So I've written some things here and there in some different places, but especially right now with track season, I get kind of busy, so I fall behind a little bit.
Awesome. Well, we will put some links into some of your articles. But thank you so much for joining us. It's great to hear personal stories sometimes too on the podcast. So really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I am happy to have on the podcast Bruce Fleming from Minneapolis, and he has just written an awesome book called The Book of Eden, which takes us through problematic passages in Genesis and shows us why they're actually not so problematic. So,
Great.
Bruce, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be.
Your book goes into Genesis 2 and 3. So the story of the fall, creation story of the fall. And I want to look, I mean, it's an amazing book. Everybody needs to get it. I know a couple of months ago, we had Cynthia Westfall on the program, and she took us through Ephesians 5:33 about respect your husbands and how it doesn't mean what we think it means. And people were like, yes, bring us more where we're just looking at one verse. And so, Bruce, you are here to talk to us about Genesis 3:16 today, because I know how many people have problems with that. And why don't you tell us what that verse says, Genesis 3:16, and the context?
I'm building on the research of my wife, Joy. So Dr. Joy Fleming really gets the credit for discovering what's in Genesis 3:16. We went over to Africa as professors in a seminary there, and the African leaders said, before you do your doctoral research, don't do it on some obscure verse somewhere. Do it on something we really care about. So she did it on Genesis 2 and 3. And as she's working through Genesis 2 and 3, she got to Genesis 3:16, where God talks to Eve in the garden. And she said to me, there's no curse here. In the Hebrew, Bruce, there's no curse. There are two curses, one on the serpent and one on the dirt. But God didn't curse Eve, and God didn't curse Adam, and God didn't put her down, limit woman in any way in Genesis 3:16. And so I said, keep going. I want to know what this is. And she did. And so that's what we have in the Book of Eden. And that's why I think it's really important, because she just takes a look at the Hebrew words and doesn't throw a whole lot of extra theological implications. She just, what's it say?
Right.
One of the biggest problems we have here in Genesis 3:16 is that about 200 years ago, people started translating the first words in 3:16 differently. If you go back to 1611, the King James Version way back then, they did okay. But in the last period of time, they've been taking the first four words in Hebrew and they've been smushing them together. And God says two things, but now if you read your modern Bible, it looks like he only says one very bad thing. And so one of the big things we can do is to take a look at Genesis 3:16, the first four words in Hebrew. And then once we get that straightened out, we can figure out the other seven words in Hebrew.
Okay, so Jenna, just so everybody knows, the verse that we're talking about is the one where I'm going to not quote it exactly because I want you to show us what it really means, but it's the one that we think is telling Eve, you're going to desire your husband and he's going to rule over you. And that's often been interpreted as God's plan is for men to be ruling over women, or that the fact that men rule over women is Eve's curse. And that So we see it in both those ways. So that's the verse we're talking about, just so everybody gets the context of it. So what are
Yeah.
the first 4 words in Hebrew that you're talking about there?
All right. He says this, uses the same verb 2 times, multiply, multiply. And when you
Mhm.
end up saying that twice, it means I'm really going to do it. So whatever it is, he's going to act in line 1. And then Joy lines it out that the rest of the verse is lines 2, 3, and 4. So what you're going for and what people really want to look at is lines 3 and 4. But we got to get line 1 first. So God
Mhm.
acts in line 1, and then he teaches her in lines 2 through 4. He's not doing anything more. He's just saying, okay, now this is the way things are. Now let me tell you about it. So
Mhm.
when he says, I'm going to do something, really going to do it, multiplying, I will multiply, he tells her the first thing, and that is itzabon. What is itzabon? That's a Hebrew word. And he
Okay.
doesn't tell her much about it. He doesn't tell us, he just says, you're going to get this thing. And then in the next verse, when God speaks to the man, he talks about what it is. All right. So what is it? God says to the man, because of you, I'm going to curse the ground, and you will have sorrowful toil when you do field work. So she will have sorrowful
Like the
toil when she does.
sorrowful toil is its bone. So
That's itzabon.
okay. Okay.
People say toil, but Joyce says no, sorrowful dash toil. So sorrowful
Mhm.
toil, what's that got to do with childbirth? Because most translations say you will have painful childbirth.
Right.
And she said that has nothing to do with childbirth. That has to do with work in the dirt with your hands, field work.
Mhm.
So then she says the second thing, the second word, the fourth word is, I will surely multiply your conception.
Uh-huh.
And she says, Bruce, look at this. The itzabon links down to the man in verse 17, and the conception links back to the serpent speech in verse 15, where God says to the serpent, you really did it bad this time, and she's going to have offspring who will crush your head.
Right.
And a lot of people call that the proto-evangelium, the very first announcement of the good news. When I
Mhm.
first learned that, I thought, why would God give the good news to the serpent tempter? Doesn't
Uh-huh.
that's But what it turns out is that God introduces the good news, and then he winds it up when he says to her, and I will surely confirm that you're going to have conception. So she's not going to have conception that will crush the serpent's head, and she will
Mhm.
have sorrowful toil because she too is working the cursed soil. And so neither one of those has to do with the end of the 9 months of pregnancy. Neither one
Okay.
of those, that's not about childbirth. It's about two things. You're going to have itzabon and you're going to have haron. You're going to have sorrowful toil and you're going to have conception.
Mhm.
So bad news, sorrowful toil. Good news, conception. So that's
Okay.
what God says to her. There's no curse there. You're going to
So
have,
just to reiterate, the itzabone that God says she's going to have is the same word that God says Adam's going to have.
right, not
Okay.
gender specific. Everybody has
Okay.
sorrowful toil. In fact, the
Mhm.
parents of Noah in chapter 5 of Genesis, they say, oh, we're going to have a new boy, a new baby, and maybe this one will help us rescue us from the itzabone, the sorrowful toil we have when we work the fields, which God cursed because of the man. Only
Okay.
3 times is that word itzabone used, and all three it has to do with the curse on the ground. No
Okay.
curse on the woman's body.
Interesting. Okay. So
So
we have
God,
pain in childbirth, but that was kind of always a given. Is that what you're saying? Like this, it's not about that.
it comes in line 2.
Okay.
So
Oh, okay. Here we go.
when we
I'm
get
getting ahead.
when we get to line 2, God says, "Now I'm going to tell you about something here. You guys sinned, and in the day you ate thereof, you died. So
Mm-hmm.
you have both of you. You have mortal bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and so and He knows that she's going to give birth outside of Eden, where He's not going to be the midwife. So
Right.
outside of Eden, what's life going to be? So in line 2, God says, and all the translations say, with terrible pain you will have children.
Mm-hmm.
But that word is etzev. It's a pun on the word tree, which is etz. And so God says, yeah, you ate from the tree with etz, and you're going to have etzev. You're going to have this, what I'm telling you about. Now, the word
Mm-hmm.
etzev, other places in the Old Testament, it's used, and no time does it talk about childbirth. It's a more of a general term. It is not related to childbirth. And so we're translating that word as with effort, you will bring forth children.
Okay.
Now, each woman delivers differently, and Joy
Uh-huh.
delivered with no painkillers, with nothing. She did it in a jungle hospital, and then she did it here in the States. And so she had natural childbirth, and we know that it takes a lot of effort. It's a
Uh-huh.
lot of work. But when we were in Africa, sometimes you're driving down the dirt road and it's muddy and you get stuck, and then everybody has to get out and push the truck out of the mud with
Uh-huh.
effort. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's this, yeah, it can be painful, but it's effort. And so God says, now I'm going to tell you about what your life is as a mortal mother outside of Eden. With effort,
Okay.
you will bring forth children. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a plural children. The other word, seed, offspring, conception, those are all singular words. She might have been looking forward to just one child. So when he tells her about effort, he also gives her good news. So Joy found there's an alternating bad news, good news, bad news, good news, bad news, good news pattern that's in this verse.
Mm-hmm.
So she, in line 2, she will, with effort, bring forth children, which is great news. God is still
Mm-hmm.
confirming the blessing on them, where He blessed them in Genesis 1, and then He tells them to, be fruitful and multiply. So yeah, they disobeyed. They were attacked. By the way, I don't call this the fall. I call Genesis 3 the attack,
Uh-huh.
and Genesis 2, I call it bare marriage. I thought you might appreciate that.
I
So
like it. Yeah, they were naked and not ashamed. Yes, yes.
where do you go in the
Yeah,
Bible to find out about bare marriage? You go to
yeah.
Genesis chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to know about the attack, you go to Genesis chapter 3. And so he's
Mm-hmm.
telling her about the attack in line 2. And then he moves down to, okay, now your desire. So in line 3, he says, your desire, then there's no verb. And so you can put in is, then to your
Mm-hmm.
husband. All right, she's a newlywed in the Garden of Eden. What has her desire been in the past? Well, they've had, I don't know how much time, but they're great. They're on their, she's still on her honeymoon in the, the
Right.
Garden of Eden B&B. So here they are, they're having a great time. He looks in her heart and he says, he confirms, your desire is still to your husband. Joy
Mm-hmm.
says, your loving desire. Okay. Your loving
Okay.
desire is still for your husband. People go, well, they say, well, what about in Genesis chapter 4? There's the word desire over there. That's not even about a human. That's about a thing, about an animal. It has desire. They have their desire, but you have your loving desire. There's only one other time that word is used, and that's in the Song of Solomon. And his lover is saying, his desire is for me, which is great. It's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People go into the Septuagint, which is the old Greek translation of Genesis 3:16, and they come up with desire. But we've seen a lot of bad translations through the years, and I think at this point already, the Septuagint was already a bad translation of Genesis 3:16. Then line 4 is he will rule over you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's the state of the man? The man heard God's words personally, don't eat from that one tree. Then he heard the serpent's words, because when the serpent speaks in the first 5 verses of Genesis 3, he uses the plural pronoun, you two, you all. So when the serpent is talking to them, he is talking to them both.
Mm-hmm.
And then she gives to her husband with her. So they're
Right.
both listening. All right. So the man heard the words from God, don't eat. And then he hears the words from the serpent, go ahead and eat. So the man was under the rule of God before, when he was alone. When he was with her, they're both under the rule of God. He hears the serpent and he disobeys the rule of God, and he decides to rule over himself. All right, now man rules over himself and follows the lead of the serpent. And then when God says, where are you? The man comes out, doesn't say, that serpent over there spoke to me and I followed his word. He doesn't even mention the serpent. Instead, he blames the woman and he blames God. So he is rebellious and he's ruling over himself, and he's kind of snarky about it. He doesn't have a good attitude. When God talks to her now, he says to her, that guy who is now ruling over himself, disobediently ruling over himself, he wants to rule over you.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't talk to the woman or to the man. God doesn't say to the man, you go rule over her. He tells her, he warns her. So he's
Right.
got good news, bad news, bad news, good news. Good news, your heart is still good. Bad news, that guy, the greatest sinner in the world, he wants to rule over you.
Mm-hmm.
And so in verse 20, when God is done talking to them both, we only have one verse where we see that they can do something on their own. And the man on his own decides to name her. And he uses a naming formula in Hebrew, which is kind of like the kings in England. They say, I dub you, Sir Lancelot.
Right.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
In Genesis chapter 2, the Hebrew is real clear. The naming formula is used, and he dubs the name, or he calls the name of each animal the name he wants to give them. So he rules over those animals and he calls them their name.
Mm-hmm.
In Genesis 5:2, it says he called their name Adam. So they are Mr. and Mrs. Adam when God's talking to them in the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
When he's done talking to them, what's the man do? He arrogates the name Adam only to himself. And then he calls her a name, like he subdued the animals and dubbed them with their names. So he calls her name. Who cares what the name is? He treats her like the subordinate animals. He is ruling over her when he calls her her name. The first thing he does is what God warned her about. Look out, he's ruling over himself, and now he's going to try to rule over you. Now, what's she going to do? She knows who's ruling over her. And now this man over here, he wants to rule over her. It's a terrible situation to be in. And it started right there with the disobedient, rebellious man in the Garden of Eden.
But she was disobedient and rebellious as well, wasn't she?
She wasn't rebellious. Remember, in the New Testament, twice it talks about Eve, and both times it says she was deceived. So that's a great point. Let's talk about that. Murder. In my town, they're talking about murder, and they're talking about first degree, second degree, third degree. And so what's going on here is they're saying, is it first degree murder? The person decided to do it, or is it second degree murder? They did it, but not on purpose. And there's punishment for each, but there's a different gradation in the punishment. When God talked to the man, he made a curse because of the man. When God talked to the woman, he didn't put on any curse because of the woman. And that's because he was a first degree eater and she was a second degree eater. He did it on purpose, rebelliously, and she had to be deceived. Satan had to trick her. And Jesus said he was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. So he came to kill them both, but he was a liar, and she'd never heard a lie before. So she was deceived. So she did not rebel. And so God says, look out, he's rebellious and he wants to rule over you. She's not rebellious. She has a good desire in her heart. And yet look what he's imposing on her.
Okay. So then, because the other thing that other people have told me when it comes to Genesis is Adam was told not to eat the fruit, but Eve wasn't told that. Eve only heard that from Adam. In the sense, does that matter at all or not? because God gave that command before Eve was even created.
That's why we started the Eden podcast. If you go back to episode 2 of the Eden podcast, or if you go to episode 3, we're talking about bare marriage, Genesis 2. And then when we get to episodes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we're talking about what happened after the attack. She could have heard from God. She could have heard from the man. She got it right when she talks to the serpent. So I don't think that, we keep looking for problems with her. When we were in Africa, we found out that people, let's say when a woman has 3, 4, 5 children, they usually come pretty easily by that point. You would know better than I would know. But when you have your first baby, sometimes it takes longer. And we heard there was a village, and over in this hut where this young woman was having her first baby, the women were abusing her because she was taking so long to give birth the first time. And they were rubbing red hot chili peppers in her eyes. They were beating her. And they were justifying this by saying you're supposed to have pain in childbirth. There's just all kinds of terrible things that go on if you think that Eve was cursed by God in the Garden of Eden. And there's all kinds of bad interpretation of New Testament passages too. If you think she was guilty, if you think she was the temptress, there's a cathedral in France where our professor took us, and here's a statue of Eve, and he said, look around the back, and there are serpents embedded in her shoulders, writhing down her back. She's got the apple in her hand, and here's this temptress. She's not the temptress. She's not rebelling. She's got good desire. She's not cursed. There are a lot of good things in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:16, and then people come up with why? Because God says to her, I will make you the combatant against him. I confirm the enmity, the battle between the serpent tempter and you. And so who's battling against her? Who would battle against the interpretation of Genesis 3:16? Who would add all these extra things and try and twist it? Throughout the ages, who's involved? I think it's the serpent tempter himself.
Right. Because I know that one of the translations of Genesis 3:16, I think it started, I don't know, I think it was Susan Foe who did it. You're probably more familiar with this than me. I don't know if it was late 60s or 70s or when it was, but she changed the verse to basically say that the problem with Eve was that her desire was to usurp Adam's authority. And so that is the essential sin of women, is that they're trying to usurp the authority of men.
Yeah.
And then because of that, he will rule over her. And I've read so many interpretations from people that are more on the, like, biblical manhood, biblical womanhood thing, that have said that, yeah, like, women's basic issue is that they are trying to take over man's rightful position.
Yeah, they say lots of things. I
Yeah.
remember when she first came out with that, she was a student and I was a student too in seminary at the same time. And then we've got a list on page 100 of the Book of Eden where we talk about the ESV and all kinds of translations and what they do with that part of Genesis 3:16.
Right.
Um, your desire shall be contrary to your husband. You will desire to control your husband. Since your trust is turning toward your husband, you will want to just lots of bad stuff in there. But you know
Hmm.
what? This is not as bad as the ancient Jewish interpretations. They came up with 10 curses on Eve. So we keep attacking Eve. We keep attacking Eve, and we say, no, she's our mother. She's
Hmm.
great. And God, look, God gave her the blessing, and God gave her the blessing in Genesis 1 to be them. He gave it to them. Be fruitful and multiply. And then he confirms it to her, multiplying, I will multiply your conception. Now
Hmm.
she knows that her offspring will defeat Satan. When I took a first course with Dr. Walter Kaiser, he got to Genesis chapter 4 and he talks about the first child. And she
Hmm.
says at the very beginning of chapter 4, I have begotten a man. There's no verb. And then she says, the Lord. And he said, there's two ways of looking at this. One is, I have begotten a man with the help of the Lord, or
Hmm.
I have begotten a man, the Lord. And he says, I think this, she believed that this was the offspring who was going to crush Satan's head. She
Right.
shows her faith. She shows her faith in the confession of Genesis 4:1.
Hmm.
I have begotten
Hmm.
a man, the promised seed.
Right.
Everything we learn about Eve is great. The kids turned out differently, didn't they? Cain
Yeah.
versus Abel. One
Yeah.
like dad, one like mom. And then Seth turned out great too. Another one like mom.
Hmm.
So I give Eve a lot of credit, and I think she deserves it all the way down. And then, of
Hmm.
course, when God says to her, I will multiply, multiplying, I will multiply your conception, that promise was ultimately fulfilled all the way down when Jesus was born through Mary.
Hmm. But you're not saying that women don't sin, or that Eve didn't sin. I just want
Eve,
to.
yeah, so he says, the day you eat thereof, you shall die. So
Right.
they both ate. They both
Hmm.
had their eyes open. They both hid.
Hmm.
They also came up with designer clothes before that. So
Yes.
yeah, so they did that. They came up with that. Why? Because they both knew. So they both ate and they both sinned. So
Right.
yeah, that happened. There's no question about that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So I've never heard that. I've never heard it that way. I know you had like, you showed me before we started recording. You had like the lines. Do you want to hold that up? I'll get Katie to put it on the screen too. But
Sure.
yes, I will surely multiply your sorrowful toil and your conception. So that's the bad news, good news. I'll multiply your toil. I'll multiply your conception. With effort, you will bring forth children. Your desire is to your husband, but he will rule over you. Okay. And that's what the Hebrew more says.
That's
That's
it, word for word.
interesting. Yeah,
Yep.
interesting.
It takes a lot of getting used to. I grew
Mhm.
up in good old church, and I heard all the things that everybody else has heard, and yet I heard things that bothered me, like why would the gospel be announced to the serpent? Why wouldn't it go to her? And then I found out, no, God confirmed it, part two, and
Right.
you will have that offspring. So there are so many good things in
Mhm.
Genesis 3:16, and yet people keep pounding on it. Remember, when you want to talk about marriage, you go to Genesis chapter 2.
Mhm.
I don't talk about the fall. I talk about the attack. All right. If you want to know about the attack and the consequences, then you go to Genesis chapter 3. Don't ever talk about the curse. There were two curses, one on the serpent body and one on the body of the earth. Those two curses. That's it. Theologically, people want to talk about the curse. No, there is no the curse. Later on, you've got the curse of the law. Yeah, there are things like that. But when you're in Genesis, there's only two Genesis curses, two Eden curses. And Eve
Mhm.
didn't get either curse, nor did Adam.
Right. Right. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. So he didn't curse people, he cursed the earth, and he cursed the serpent.
Yeah,
Okay. And then he was just telling people what was going to happen to them from now on.
you got it. That's right.
Okay. Interesting. That's
Yeah.
that's that's brilliant.
And he assures her, you've got great desire. And he
Mhm.
tells her, look out, he desires to rule over you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Bruce, you have a podcast where each season you go through a different problematic passage. So you started it out with Genesis 2 and 3
Right.
in your first season, and then you did Ephesians 5 in your second season,
Ephesians 5 and 6. Yeah, that's
5 and
done now.
6.
Mhm.
Okay. And then next season is First Timothy
We're right
2.
in the middle. We're right in the middle. We're doing the first 3 chapters of First Timothy, and so
Okay.
just we just finished up 11 and 12, where it says,
Uh-huh.
I suffer not a woman to have authority, and
Right.
that cleans up real nice.
Mm-hmm.
Especially then the next verses where he refers to Eve and Adam in the Garden of Eden, and
Yes.
and it's good. He talks about that, and he says it in verse 15. She will be saved through the birth of the child, capital
Right.
C, the birth of
Right.
the child. So
Right.
it's Paul understood Genesis 3:16 very well.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I will put up links where you can find Bruce and his podcast, and the Book of Eden is available, I assume, on Amazon and
Yes.
everywhere that, yes,
Yep.
and I will put up links for that too. And that is wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been great.
Thank you, and I'll get back to reading my good book here for a minute.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, those were deep.
Yes.
And interesting. I
Yes.
hope you found them interesting. I certainly did. And now, before we get to some encouragement emails, I want to ask for your encouragement. So next week is our 100th episode of the Bare Marriage Podcast.
That's so exciting. That's insane.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can't believe, yes, we've done this for 100 whole episodes. And so we would love to feature some of your voices next week. So here's what I'm asking you to do. If you have enjoyed our podcast, will you send me a video or an audio recording, whichever is easiest for you? It really doesn't matter to me.
Yes.
About, let's say, a minute long. If it's not a minute long, that's okay. If
But
it's
it
less,
might get edited down to a minute,
yes.
just so you know.
And it can be something like this. Say your first name and the city you're in. So I'm Sheila from Belleville, Ontario.
And if you prefer to keep one of those, you can also do, hi, I'm Tracy from the U.S. If
yes,
you'd
that's
prefer to,
fine.
yeah.
And just tell us either something that you've learned from listening to our podcast, your favorite episode, or how your marriage has changed.
Yeah.
Okay, something you've learned, your favorite episode, or how your marriage has changed. Or you just want to give us some encouragement, you can do that too. We are going to have a link to where you can send that in the podcast description to this podcast. So please go ahead and do that. You need to do it by next Tuesday, which is May 11th.
Because Katie edits the podcast on Wednesday.
Yes, so we would just love to feature just a few of them next week. So if you would send those in, that would be great. To end out this show, we just have a few quick things to share that are encouraging and challenging and good all at the same time. So this was a tweet that came in to me this week, which I thought was amazing. And she said, our marriage almost ended because of my extreme submissiveness. He too had married me partly for my brain, but I somehow thought I was supposed to check that. Anyway, we had a huge wake-up call and we celebrated 25 years this past year.
That's amazing. And I think this is what really always strikes me whenever I talk to women about this kind of thing, is they're married to men who don't necessarily want, in essence, a servant. Mm-hmm. But often Christian books are portrayed where unless you are kind of like this 60s housewife, completely just devoted to doting on your husband all the time and doing whatever he says, whatever he asks, and then you're a bad wife. But your husband married you.
Yeah.
He likes you.
He likes you. He wants your opinions. And so when we don't share because we think that's being unsubmissive, we actually can endanger our relationship because there's no intimacy anymore.
Well, and frankly, you enable a lot of entitlement and power mongering in a marriage, even with a man who wouldn't otherwise do that.
Mm-hmm. And even if her husband wasn't like that, I think guys still, most good guys want to be engaged with you. Like
I think
they
so,
want
too.
that real intimacy, which can only come when you share.
And we've heard
So-
that over and over and over again. Your husband wants to be married to you, and he married you for a reason.
Yeah.
And don't sacrifice that reason on the altar of the perfect Christian submissive wife.
You don't need to become small so that your marriage can be good.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Most marriages thrive when both people really live out their calling.
Yep. Here's another encouraging message that I got on Facebook this week. A woman says, I actually gave The Great Sex Rescue to my teenage son, and I had him read the chapters on lust and porn. He thanked me profusely after and said it's the best news he has ever had. It's been so freeing for him.
Oh.
I know you didn't know that one before. A lot of people are actually reading the book with their teenagers, which we were not
Older
expecting.
teenagers, yeah.
We were not expecting that, but
But it makes sense. Teens are ready to talk about this stuff.
yeah.
They're
Yeah.
already talking about it. They're already living it.
Yeah.
A lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of moms have been sharing it with their older adult children, sort of like 21, 22, and just getting these messages right. So, and we do think, honestly, what we say about lust and porn is not man bashing. It's freeing.
No, it's like you're allowed to be a man and you're allowed to not be ashamed of that, but also being a man doesn't mean that you are automatically going to lust, objectify, and become a predator at any moment. So.
Yep. Okay, and here finally is our encouraging email from someone.
Okay.
So she is writing in about the Great Sex Rescue. Wait, for everyone watching, I'm just hot flashing here, menopause. I gotta take the sweater off. I knit this, by the way. Isn't it lovely? Okay, here we go. So she says, my husband doesn't enjoy reading books, but when I shared with him some of the horrible ideas I've gotten from other books, he was horrified. He was like, yeah, the problem I have with most books other than the Bible, which is true, is that it's someone's opinion. I told him your blog is one of the reasons I was able to relax with him. He still won't read, but we do talk about stuff. Our marriage has gotten a lot better too because honestly you had some of the best advice about setting healthy boundaries. I honestly think it saved our marriage, whereas other advice literally caused me horrendous mental anguish, and we even separated briefly years ago after I took the advice of one particular author. I also wandered away from being connected to a church family because it was too painful to get told all the things I was supposed to do just to deal with, which were not healthy. I've since reconnected to a good congregation. And as for me and my husband, we've come a long way. I think you would enjoy your writing if you like to read, because he does now treat me well and we're a team. Basically, it comes down to if we love Jesus, we love each other, and we do our best to act in love towards each other. So thank you for keeping up what must be an exhausting task. I think people forget marriage can be awesome. We make it about a bunch of rules instead of just enjoying a relationship, much like our relationship with Christ. It's much sweeter when we fall in love with Jesus because we want to do what pleases him as opposed to doing X, Y, and Z out of fear or obligation. Perfect love casts out all fear, as the Bible says, and I just wanted to say that I appreciate your writing.
Oh, that's sweet. It's always good to hear that marriages are doing better when they hear healthy advice.
Yeah. So there you go. So let's just be healthy. Let's listen.
Yeah.
And we want to make it clear that and I hope, I do truly mean this, that I'm always going to try to listen.
Yeah.
And if I've said something wrong, I really do want to fix it. And even this week, I've been revising some older posts that I'm going to rerun because I don't agree with what I said before.
Yep. And probably in 10 years, if we're still writing on this stuff, it's probably going to be slightly different because we'll know more information.
And culture
And that
changes.
is how it should be. Again, none of us, and we say this again and again and again, none of us is called to perfection today.
No.
What we are called to is to do the best with what we know. And so now that we know better than we did 10 years ago when these books were at their heyday, let's do better. We don't need love and respect anymore.
No.
We don't need for women only anymore.
No.
We don't need every man's battle because there's a better way. There's an evidence-based way, and there's a more Christ-like way that we can do moving forward.
Yep. So when we know better, we do better.
Yep.
And that's our commitment to you, is that if we ever know better, we will always endeavor to do better.
Yep.
And we will tell you that we have changed as well. So thank you for joining us on the Bare Marriage Podcast.
Yes, thank you.
And we will see you again next week for our 100th episode.
Yay!